Hello, and welcome to our second instructional video on how to plan UAS flight operations. This series of videos is brought to you by AmericaView in partnership with the College of Natural Resources and Environment at Virginia Tech, the Virginia Cooperative Extension, and Geoted UAS. My name is Daniel Cross, and I will continue to be your guide. In this video, we will be going over how to digitally scout a work area. This is the first step to formulating a flight plan, and understanding your surroundings is critical to safe and responsible UAS operations. That said, digital scouting is not a replacement for scouting out the work site in person. It does, however, allow you to create a flight plan ahead of time that can then be altered in the field as required. There are a number of tools that you can use to start scouting. Some are more advanced than others. As you gain experience with commercial UAS operations, you will learn the tools that best fit your need. My first step will be to use a VFR sectional chart to check the airspace to make sure it's both safe and legal to fly at my intended worksite. We've already covered this in another set of videos, so I will not go over that now. To learn more about VFR sectional charts, please see our other series of instructional videos on the AmericaView YouTube channel titled Mastering the Aeronautical Chart for UAS Operators. So after we've checked our airspace, let's start with one of the simplest and most useful scouting aids, Google Earth. Google Earth is such a good scouting tool because it is both free and gives us a lot of information about the world around us. Let's start with the basics. First, we need to find our work area. This can be done by searching for an address, town, landmark, geospatial coordinates, or simply by zooming into the location. For this example, let's zoom into Kentland Agricultural Extension Center. You can see that I've already done some scouting here and have marked locations that are important to my work. I've marked places I've either flown from or mapped with our UAS, as well as an area to the southeast that I want to avoid. However, if this is my first time flying at this location, I would not see any of that. The first step is to look over the entire area to get a feel for the site and its surroundings. With this broad view, we want to look for anything that would pose any sort of risk to our flights, as well as anything that our operations might pose a risk to. In this broad view, I can see that my main work site is a rural farm, but there's a built-up area to the southeast. With just a little sleuthing, I can find out that this is the Radford Army Ammunition Plant. I'll want to avoid this for two reasons. The first is that it's a built-up area where people are likely to be working outside, and Part 107, as well as good sense, prohibits me from flying around non-participating people in such a way as that I could pose a risk of injury. The second reason is that both FAA documentation and some online VFR sectional chart services mark this as a drone no-fly zone. To help me keep track of this, I'm going to drop a pin here to mark it as off-limits. Next, I'm going to identify the area that I'm going to be flying in. For this example, we'll be mapping the fields by the river. I'll use the polygon tool to mark my mission area. Now, I want to zoom in and start looking at the site in greater detail. I'll start by looking at the overall landscape. I want to identify good places for my control station, while thinking about line of sight, looking for places to take off and land from, looking for alternative landing sites in case of emergency, and I want to be looking for more immediate hazards to my operation. I also want to use Google Earth's 3D terrain feature to see if I need to plan for difficult topography. Conveniently, there's already a runway here made for UAS, so I'm going to set up my control station there. Looking at the 3D terrain, it seems that I'll have good line of sight from this vantage point. However, the house and trees to the southwest might pose a problem if I fly too low. I also see that my control station is going to be about 35 feet higher than the area I want to map. If my flight planning software does not take this into consideration, I need to plan my flight altitude to be about 35 feet lower than I would have expected. If my flight planning software does account for this difference in ground elevation, then I need to make sure that this feature is turned on. One nice feature that Google Earth provides is a measuring tool. We must keep our UAV within line of sight throughout the entire flight. This tool allows us to measure and mark the extent of our site. Now, this will depend on the UAV used and who's flying it. you may only be able to see a small quadcopter less than 1,000 feet away, whereas larger fixed-wing UAV may be visible for up to a mile. The safe distance that you can maintain visual line of sight is, however, up to the discretion of the operator. Through experience, I know that I can see the UAV I'm going to use here out to about 3,000 feet away, and measuring from my ground station, I see that my furthest point is 2,500 feet away, so I'm good to go. Now, I'm going to plan both takeoff and landing to happen on this runway. I'm also going to mark some alternative landing sites along this track, placing them out of the test plot so I don't go traipsing through anyone's crops. If something happens, such as a crop duster entering my work area, these are areas I know I can quickly find and land at. Next, I notice that there are several buildings near my control station where people may be working. If there's anyone working outside, I'll need to be ready to alter my flight plans to steer clear of them. I also take note of the railroad that bisects the fields that I want to map and the roads nearby. Part 107 does not allow us to fly over moving vehicles, so I need to be aware of any approaching cars or trains so I can avoid them. Zooming in further, I can start looking in even greater detail. To the north of the airstrip, you can see some long, narrow shadows. Since there's a line of these shadows, that tells me that there are power lines present, which can certainly pose a risk to a UAV flight, especially a fixed-wing UAV while it's taking off or landing. One little fun fact while we're zoomed in here. While I was making this video, I noticed our work truck was parked by the airstrip, and the image date that Google Earth gives us tells me that this is myself and a colleague shooting the video that was used in the introduction of this series. Another nice feature is the historical imagery timeline. Sometimes the default image is not the best. In this instance, I want to use my UAV to map the distribution of forested wetlands. However, the default imagery is leaf on and has clouds in it, but I need to see the forest floor to create a flight plan. If I use the timeline feature to go back to an older image, I can find one that was captured in winter when the leaves of deciduous trees have fallen and I can see the outline of the wetlands on the forest floor. Now, let's move on to a more advanced tool, Geographic Information Systems, or GIS for short. For these videos, I'll be using Esri's ArcGIS, but there are other options for you to research on your own, such as QGIS. The scopes of these videos does not allow us to go into much detail, but I want to show you some examples of what a GIS program can do, and we'll end this session with some good sources of data, including those I use in these examples. Let's start with a fairly simple map. This shows us 2 coastal wetlands in Connecticut, where we were testing to see if UAS could be used for waterfowl counts. I used this map to delineate my mission areas, shown in blue. These are the areas that we wanted to photograph. But I also marked some roads, residential areas, and a tower in the red circle that I need to avoid. Maps like this are good aids for making changes to your flight plan in the field. They're also good for communicating with anyone you might be partnering with or with the local community. We also created the zoomed-in map for a behavioral test flight. One of our partners' goals was to record the bird's reaction to the UAVs to ensure that this would not produce undue stress in the animal. Here, we split one of the mission areas into zones marked with a letter. I was unable to see the birds from my vantage point, but the biologists who were observing the birds were able to guide my UAV to them. It also marks areas where line of sight at lower altitudes is obstructed by trees, essentially showing me my no-fly zones. Here's another example, from a project where I was mapping ramps, an onion native to Appalachia. The normal imagery you would see in Google Earth doesn't really give us a good idea of how difficult this terrain can be. But if we switch to a United States Geological Survey topographic map, we can see that the terrain is rather steep, making maintaining visual line of sight problematic. To better visualize this terrain, I downloaded a LiDAR digital elevation model, or DEM, and color-coded it to make the elevation difference really pop out. The DEM shows us here that there's about 175 meter, or approximately 575 foot, difference in elevation between my control station and the lowest area I want to map. This is not insignificant, and frankly I wasn't sure if I could maintain visual line of sight for this entire flight. Fortunately, we can play around with this DEM to determine where line of sight will be lost. So I created what's called a viewshed, which you can see here. This is a fairly simple viewshed. It just shows us where we can see the ground from the control station and where we can't. However, we're not flying near the ground. We'll be flying about 350 feet above ground level, or AGL. If we use the raster calculator, we can make another viewshed that shows the lowest altitude AGL we can fly our UAV and still be within visual line of sight. Now, this does not take trees into account, but it does seem that we should be able to see the UAV almost anywhere on this map, with the exception of this dark purple area to the east. Now, there's much more that can be done with GIS that is beyond the scope of this video. If you're interested in learning more about GIS and LiDAR, check out these videos, or see if your school offers classes in GIS and remote sensing. Let's wrap up GIS with an overview of good sources of ancillary information that can be used for scouting and flight planning. If you need a property boundary, like this one at Kentland Farm, try checking with your local county GIS office. Also, some state GIS departments may offer this information. A lot of my data comes from the Virginia VETA site and GIS services. Here you can find imagery, parcel information, and some background layers. Many other states will also provide similar services. The USDA and USGS both have great GIS services where you can stream data without having to download it. And the USGS site Earth Explorer is also a great source of downloadable imagery, LiDAR, and other GIS data. One last app that is useful for scouting is Before You Fly. This app was created by the FAA and is run by Kitty Hawk. It's not really an official source of information, as it was originally designed for UAS hobbyists. However, it has evolved to be a potentially useful tool for commercial operators as well, as long as you are aware that a lot of the airspace it marks as potential restrictions do not necessarily apply to commercial UAS operations under Part 107. With location enabled, it will default to your current location, in this case, Blacksburg, Virginia. Here it will show us areas on the map where airspace restrictions may be in effect, such as this yellow circle that I'm currently in. This is telling us that we are near the Virginia Tech Airport, the University Stadium, a local hospital with a helipad, and that there are 2 military training routes nearby. Recalling the VFR sectional chart, we noted that there is no controlled airspace extending from the surface up at this location, and the airport and hospital helipads are non-towered airports. So for operations under Part 107, we can fly in this airspace, whereas a recreational drone pilot may have to request authorization. But this is still good information since it warns us of the possibility of higher volumes of manned air traffic. The stadium will only be a problem if there's a temporary flight restriction issued via notice to airmen. We'll cover how to check those in videos 6 and 7. The notification about the military training routes will not restrict our flights either. However, we now know that we must be extra vigilant for the possibility of high-speed, low-altitude military aircraft. If we zoom out a little, we can see the Radford Army Ammunition Plant is marked in red, since, as we discussed before, this is a no-fly zone for drone pilots. To the north, we also have the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, which is another no-fly zone as it's a national park. This app is useful for both scouting ahead of time as well as something that you can check the morning before a flight. Just remember that for commercial operators, this will not replace checking NOTAMs or a proper weather briefing. And make sure that you can tell the difference between restrictions for hobbyist pilots and commercial UAS pilots. Thank you for joining us. In the next video, we will take a look at planning automated mapping flights with a fixed-wing UAS. Fly safe.